She should not have been on that floor at 00:17. 30 seconds later, her name was already being removed from internal systems she did not know existed. The service elevator froze between levels without a sound. No jolt, no warning, no mechanical complaint. It stopped with deliberate precision and held her suspended in a narrow metal box for exactly 22 seconds. Long enough for someone upstairs to finish what they had started. Long enough for the cameras to look away. Long enough for a decision to become irreversible. When the doors finally opened, the corridor outside appeared empty, but the emptiness felt engineered. The lighting was fully engaged, bright enough to erase shadows and leave nowhere for doubt to hide. The air carried a faint antiseptic scent, clinical and out of place among perfume, alcohol, and recycled luxury. It felt like a hospital corridor disguised as a casino hallway. She stepped out because routine had trained her to correct anomalies rather than question them. She had learned to close doors, smooth surfaces, and erase evidence of discomfort before guests noticed it. That training moved her feet before her fear could catch up. One door stood ajar. Not wide enough to invite entry, wide enough to signal that someone had been interrupted. Inside, the suite looked frozen mid-gesture. A man lay on the carpet near the glass wall, his expensive white shirt soaked through at the ribs, blood spreading outward in a dark, patient bloom. His breathing came in wet, uneven pulls, the sound of lungs refusing to cooperate. Near his hand rested a hard black medical case marked with the seal of a laboratory she recognized from televised charity events. On the low table, documents lay scattered, their paper heavy and textured, stamped with a foundation logo associated with children, research, and hope. The signatures beneath it belonged to people whose names moved markets. The contradiction, registered before fear did. Casinos did not host medical transfers. Charity foundations did not share tables with private gaming suites. Blood did not belong on carpets replaced every month. Someone else was already there. The second figure did not rush or panic. The posture was relaxed, movements economical, as if time itself deferred. Clean gloves covered steady hands. 2 fingers pressed lightly against the wounded man's neck, not with urgency but with assessment. The action carried no mercy, only calculation, as if survival were a line item rather than a moral decision. Then the figure turned toward the doorway. Toward her. Her body reacted faster than her thoughts. She stepped back, her shoulder striking the frame. The trash bag slipped from her grip. Her phone fell and struck the floor near the threshold. The screen lit instantly on impact, the camera activating by reflex. For less than a second, it recorded a face that showed no surprise at being seen. That second changed everything. The suite lights flickered once, clean and synchronized. Her phone lost signal so abruptly it felt like silence snapping shut. Somewhere behind her, a lock engaged with a soft mechanical sound, too controlled to be accidental. The door behind her shifted inward as if guided by a careful hand. She understood then that she was no longer a witness. She was a flaw. She ran. She moved down the corridor with breath tearing at her chest, the carpet swallowing the sound of her steps. No one shouted. No alarms sounded. Behind her came something worse than pursuit, steady footsteps, unhurried, perfectly spaced. The sound of people who corrected errors for a living. She reached the staff access door and shoved through into the service corridors where luxury ended and concrete began. The smell changed to bleach and metal. Fluorescent lights cast a sickly hue over exposed pipes and utility panels. The casino above continued to pulse with music and laughter, oblivious, while below it the building digested its waste. Her phone buzzed once in her hand, then went dead again. The last frozen frame showed a blurred sliver of gloved skin and unblinking eyes. Proof measured in milliseconds. She descended the stairwell 2 steps at a time, railing slick under her palm. The footsteps followed, never closing too fast, never falling back. She reached the lowest level and burst into the loading dock, where trucks waited in ordered rows like patient animals. The night air outside was dry and cool, carrying exhaust and dust instead of perfume. She ran toward the street, toward randomness, toward any uncontrolled variable. A black car without plates slid into view and stopped exactly where it needed to. The door opened before she reached it. Cold air spilled from inside, scented with leather, tobacco, and something sharper beneath. A man sat within, composed, his attention lifted from a phone glowing with unreadable numbers. He did not look like security or police. He looked like consequence. He said her name calmly, precisely, as if it had been written into his schedule hours earlier. She had never told him her name. The footsteps behind her reached the edge of the dock and paused. The city held its breath. She understood then that the murder upstairs had not been the beginning of the night. It had been preparation. The elevator, the cameras, the silence, the car, all of it had aligned around her presence with terrifying accuracy. Her name had become the next item to be erased. And the only person capable of stopping that erasure was the one who had known it was coming. The car did not head toward the city. That was the first thing she noticed once the strip disappeared behind them and the lights thinned into scattered constellations. The road stretched outward, not forward, pulling them away from noise, away from witnesses, away from any version of reality that relied on crowds for protection. Las Vegas shrank in the rearview mirror until it became a low glow trapped against the horizon, a reminder rather than a presence. She sat in silence, her body rigid, senses sharpened by shock. The interior of the car was too clean, too carefully curated. No clutter, no personal objects, nothing that suggested spontaneity. The air temperature was perfectly regulated, cool enough to slow her pulse without numbing it. The windows were tinted past transparency, turning the outside world into a moving shadow. She tried her phone again out of reflex, knowing it would not work. The screen lit, then faded, obedient to rules she could not see. No one restrained her. No one touched her. That absence was deliberate. Control, she understood dimly, did not need force when certainty did the work. The city gave way to desert. The road cut through darkness where the land flattened and rose in shallow waves, scrub and rock catching the headlights like fragments of bone. The farther they went, the more the world simplified. No billboards, no gas stations, no signals competing for attention, just distance and speed and the quiet certainty that no one would hear her if she screamed. They drove long enough for panic to exhaust itself and leave behind something colder. When the car finally slowed, it was not for a gate or checkpoint. The road simply curved upward, climbing toward a low ridge where a structure waited without lights announcing its presence. The house did not dominate the hill. It occupied it with precision, as if it had been calculated rather than designed. Glass, stone, and steel blended into the slope, reflecting the night instead of interrupting it. Cameras were there, but they did not advertise themselves. She felt them before she saw them, sensed the way the space responded to movement. The car passed through an invisible perimeter, and something shifted subtly in the air, the way pressure changed in sealed environments. Inside, the silence was complete. Not the silence of emptiness, but of systems running perfectly. Climate control hummed somewhere beyond perception. Electricity flowed without sound. Even the floors absorbed footsteps, engineered to remove echoes. She was led inside by people who did not introduce themselves. Not guards, not staff, something in between. Their movements were efficient, their expressions neutral, their attention always half a second ahead of her position. They did not rush her. They did not watch her too closely. They already knew where she was at all times. A room was prepared for her without ceremony. Clean clothes waited on the bed, folded with impersonal care. Water stood on a low table beside a glass that had been warmed slightly, not chilled. The bathroom light turned on automatically when she stepped inside, revealing towels unused, surfaces untouched. Everything smelled faintly of citrus and antiseptic, a neutral scent meant to calm rather than comfort. She drank the water because her body demanded it. She changed because her clothes smelled like blood and metal and fear. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her eyes looked too bright, her skin too pale. The night had already begun to rearrange her. No one told her to sleep. No one told her anything at all. Time stretched in that room, elastic and undefined. Without windows or clocks, she lost her sense of duration. Minutes bled into each other until exhaustion dulled the edges of her thoughts. She sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for instructions that did not arrive, waiting for panic to return and finish the job it had started. Instead, awareness sharpened. She noticed the way the door closed without a sound, how the handle did not turn from the outside, how the walls were too thick for voices to travel. She tested the window, finding it sealed seamlessly into the structure. The house was not built to keep people out. It was built to keep people in without making them feel trapped. That realization settled in her chest like a weight. He appeared without announcement. One moment, the room held only her breathing and the low hum of unseen systems. The next, he stood near the doorway as if he had always been there, his presence folding into the space with unsettling ease. He did not invade her distance. He did not claim the room. He observed it, and by extension, her. Up close, he looked less dramatic than she had expected and more dangerous for it. There was nothing theatrical about him, nothing exaggerated. His clothing was simple, precise, chosen to disappear rather than impress. His face bore no obvious scars, no overt markers of violence or indulgence. It was the face of someone who belonged anywhere and owed explanations nowhere. He did not rush to reassure her. He did not apologize. He allowed the silence to stretch until she understood that it was part of the process. When he spoke, it was with restraint, the kind that suggested he had learned which details mattered and which ones created unnecessary noise. He did not describe the night as a crime or an accident. He described it as a convergence. What she had seen was not an isolated act of brutality, but a correction within a much larger mechanism. Money moved through cities like blood through bodies, and sometimes clots had to be removed. The places where medicine, philanthropy, and entertainment overlapped were particularly profitable, particularly dangerous. He made it clear, without emphasis, that what she had recorded had value far beyond its length. She listened, tense, her hands curled tightly in the fabric of the blanket at her sides. Every instinct told her to leave, to create distance, to reclaim motion. She stood abruptly, the decision forming before permission could interfere. He did not block her path. He did not raise his voice. He simply allowed reality to assert itself. Her phone, he explained, no longer functioned independently. Her bank accounts were temporarily inaccessible, not frozen but rerouted, awaiting confirmation of identity. The building she worked in would not call her tomorrow. Her absence would be noted, then explained away with a termination notice she would never see. The people who had followed her would not appear in reports because they did not exist on paper. He did not threaten her. He described outcomes. If she left the house now, she would reach the road. The car that brought her would not follow. Another vehicle would. That vehicle would not bring her somewhere quiet. The desert held many places where mistakes dissolved cleanly. He did not say this with cruelty. He said it with the detached clarity of someone explaining gravity. She sat back down slowly, anger burning through the fear. The knowledge that she was safer here made her feel smaller, not relieved. She hated that her breathing eased in his presence, that the chaos of the night organized itself around him like filings around a magnet. His control was not physical, it was structural. He offered protection, but the word felt inadequate. What he offered was enclosure, containment, a suspension of the forces that wanted to erase her, achieved not by defiance but by ownership of the space in which those forces operated. She understood then why the house felt the way it did. It was not a refuge, it was a node. Around him, people moved with subtle efficiency. She caught glimpses of them through glass walls and open spaces, individuals checking screens, adjusting routes, making calls that ended before they began. No one questioned his presence or decisions. They responded as if he were part of the infrastructure. She hated that she was beginning to see him not as a man, but as an environment. The tension between them settled into something dense and unspoken. She resented the calm he imposed on her fear, resented the way her body responded to safety after minutes of terror. She sensed, too, that he was accustomed to people attaching themselves to circumstances rather than choices. People became assets or liabilities depending on how well they adapted. He did not ask her to trust him. He did not need to. Trust, she realized, was irrelevant when alternatives had been mathematically eliminated. As he prepared to leave, she noticed something that unsettled her more than any explanation he had given. He had intervened personally. Someone with his reach could have delegated her disappearance as easily as her protection. The fact that he had chosen neither option suggested an interest that went beyond convenience. When he stepped out, the room did not feel empty again. The air retained the imprint of his presence, like a pressure change that took time to equalize. She lay back on the bed without sleeping, staring at a ceiling designed to reveal nothing. Her thoughts looped through fragments. Blood on carpet, a gloved face caught by accident, her name spoken in a place where names were liabilities. Safety pressed in on her from all sides. It did not feel like freedom. It felt like the first wall of a cage being quietly locked into place. Las Vegas accepted her back without resistance. The city never resisted anything that promised profit, spectacle, or plausible deniability. It absorbed her return the way it absorbed scandals and disappearances, wrapping them in light and sound until they resembled entertainment. From a distance, nothing had changed. The strip still burned with neon arteries. Music still spilled from open doors. Smiles still came easily, practiced and empty. He did not hide her. That was the first deviation from what she expected. Instead of erasing her from the grid, he adjusted her angle within it. He reintroduced her to the city not as someone invisible, but as someone visible in a controlled way. Just enough presence to make any sudden absence noticeable, just enough relevance to turn an accident into a question. Her new work was not in a hotel. It was worse. An elite service operated quietly beneath a members-only club that did not advertise its existence. No signage, no online presence, access granted through referrals, not reservations. The clientele did not gamble money. They gambled leverage, timing, and silence. Deals were sealed with handshakes and eye contact, then enforced through contracts that never reached public courts. Her role placed her close enough to hear fragments, but far enough to be dismissed. She learned quickly that the most dangerous conversations happened in polite tones, over clean glasses and soft music. The room was always warm, the lighting flattering, the atmosphere engineered to make people forget that decisions made their ruined lives elsewhere. She became part of the display. Not an ornament, but a fixture. Someone whose presence suggested normalcy. Someone who made the space feel legitimate. She understood the logic immediately. If something happened to her now, it would not look like a coincidence. It would look like disruption. That thin layer of protection felt brittle. The city adjusted its tactics. No one followed her openly. No dark sedans idled too long near her building. No threats arrived wrapped in violence. Instead, pressure appeared in fragments small enough to deny. A complaint filed against her at work, anonymous and impeccably worded. A fine issued for a violation she could not recall committing. A warning from management delivered with regret rather than accusation. Her schedule shifted without explanation, hours reduced, responsibilities altered just enough to destabilize her footing. She noticed the way people looked at her differently. Not with suspicion, but with assessment. Security personnel lingered a second too long. Legal advisors passed through the club with smiles that never reached their eyes. Men and women in tailored suits asked harmless questions designed to establish patterns. Where she lived, how long she had been in the city, whether she planned to stay. She learned that hunting did not require teeth when paperwork worked just as well. Her apartment changed. She realized it the moment she stepped inside after a late shift. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, but objects had shifted by centimeters. A glass turned slightly on the counter. A book placed spine out instead of face down. The lock engaged more smoothly than usual, recently serviced. The message was clear. Her space had been accessed, cataloged, and returned to its previous state with intentional care. Sleep became impossible. She began checking reflections, memorizing exits, counting steps. She stopped trusting silence. The city sounded different when she listened closely. Ventilation systems, distant traffic, elevators moving behind walls. Vegas breathed constantly, a massive organism feeding on attention and money, and she had wandered into one of its vital organs. One night, she powered on her phone without thinking. The screen flickered, then stabilized. A fragment of video loaded before she could stop it. Corrupted, incomplete, but intact enough. Less than a second. A face partially obscured by gloves, eyes lifted directly toward the lens. No surprise, no fear, recognition. Her chest tightened. The fragment should not have existed. Whatever system had attempted to erase it had failed, or someone had allowed it to fail. The data was small enough to hide, insignificant enough to overlook, dangerous enough to matter. She showed it to him. For the first time since she had met him, his control fractured. Not overtly, not dramatically, just a micro-movement around the eyes, a subtle recalibration of posture. Recognition passed through him quickly, followed by something colder. Personal. The figure in the video was not a disposable contractor. It was not a nameless intermediary. It belonged to a structure he understood intimately. From that moment, his proximity changed. He did not announce it. He simply began to appear when pressure peaked. Complaints dissolved before escalating. Management reversed decisions quietly. Her reduced hours returned without apology. The building manager stopped responding to the anonymous reports that had flooded his inbox. Problems resolved themselves before she finished identifying them. That precision unsettled her more than any threat. He was not reacting. He was anticipating. The city watched. Vegas always watched its own blood flow, and now it watched her, curious to see whether she would be absorbed or rejected. Smiles continued. Drinks were poured. Deals were made. But beneath the spectacle, knives were being sharpened, not with steel but with clauses, affidavits, and reputations. She felt the hook tightening. Every step she took toward understanding made her life less dangerous and more unlivable. Safety became conditional. Comfort required compliance. The absence of violence depended on her staying exactly where she was placed. The city did not want her dead. It wanted her manageable. And as the lights burned brighter around her, she understood the most dangerous truth of all. Vegas did not hunt in darkness. It smiled while it cut. She understood the limitation before she understood the solution. The city had taught her enough by then. Las Vegas did not fear exposure, did not panic at scandal, did not collapse under truth. It absorbed those things, diluted them, turned them into noise. Police reports disappeared into jurisdictional fog. Journalists learned which questions shortened careers. Whistleblowers burned fast and quietly. What mattered here was not law. What mattered was access. Not access to justice, but access to people who owned silence as a resource. People for whom quiet was not the absence of sound, but a commodity purchased, traded, and enforced. She reached that conclusion standing in the mirrored bathroom of her apartment, watching her own face fracture into reflections. The city had not tried to kill her again. That alone was proof. Violence was inefficient. What followed instead was a tightening circle of pressure, precise enough to keep her breathing, narrow enough to keep her contained. She needed to move upward, not outward. He did not interrupt her reasoning. When he offered the solution, it was not framed as rescue. It was presented as architecture. A public association. Visibility, elevated to immunity. If she remained adjacent to him, openly and consistently, she would no longer be a loose variable. She would become part of his declared perimeter. Any attempt to touch her would require explanation, alignment, and consequence. Not impossible, but costly. Cost was the only language the city respected. Formally, the arrangement could be described in a dozen neutral ways. Contractual companionship, strategic presence, a mutually beneficial alignment, the kind of relationship that attracted curiosity but discouraged intrusion. Informally, it was a claim. Not romantic, not emotional. Territorial. The understanding settled heavily in her chest. She had spent years avoiding ownership in every form, mistaking distance for independence. Now distance meant exposure. Freedom, stripped of protection, equaled erasure. The conflict sharpened inside her, uncomfortable and raw. She wanted autonomy, not shelter. She wanted truth without debt. She wanted to believe that survival did not require submission. And yet every path she traced without him ended the same way, disappearance disguised as accident. Her attraction to him had nothing to do with tenderness. It was gravitational. He reduced chaos simply by existing. Systems bent around his decisions. Problems aligned themselves into solvable shapes. She hated that relief followed him like a shadow. Hated that her pulse steadied when he was near. Hated that part of her wanted to lean into the certainty he offered, even knowing the cost. He did not promise safety. He promised leverage. Their arrangement began quietly. No announcements, no declarations, just proximity made deliberate, appearances aligned, invitations extended that included her by default. She learned quickly how to occupy space beside him without decoration or apology. She did not cling. She did not soften. She observed and adapted. The city noticed immediately. Eyes followed them now, not hers alone. Whispers shifted tone. Curiosity hardened into calculation. She felt the change like a pressure drop, the moment when a storm committed to formation. Her first test came at the charity auction. The event wore its respectability carefully. Soft lighting, minimal branding. A guest list curated to appear philanthropic rather than predatory. The venue overlooked the city from above, glass walls framing Vegas as a glittering abstraction rather than a place where people lived and died. She recognized the names as soon as she saw the programs. Foundations tied to medical research, private healthcare networks, investment groups with opaque portfolios, casinos that funneled money into clean hands before returning it stained. The same signatures she had seen on the table in the bloodstained suite appeared again, printed elegantly beneath pledges and donation figures. It was all the same system, just a different costume. She moved through the room beside him, aware of how carefully people calibrated their approach. They greeted him with familiarity masked as respect. They greeted her with interest sharpened by restraint. No one asked who she was. That question would have implied uncertainty. Instead, they asked what she thought. About art, about causes, about strategy disguised as benevolence. She listened more than she spoke, cataloging tells. The way certain men avoided her gaze, the way others lingered too long, the subtle recalibration when they realized she was not ornamental. She understood then why he had brought her here. Visibility was not the point. Recognition was. If she was seen in this room, aligned with him, then her existence was documented in the minds of people who counted. She was no longer an easy subtraction. Removing her would disrupt balance sheets, alliances, and favors owed. Protection through inconvenience. The night progressed without incident until it didn't. The approach was smooth, almost polite. The man who intercepted her as she moved toward the balcony was young, immaculately dressed, his composure practiced to perfection. He did not leer. He did not threaten. He smiled the way people smiled when they believed themselves untouchable. He did not acknowledge him at first. He focused on her. The conversation he initiated was unremarkable on the surface. Compliments calibrated to sound sincere. Observations designed to establish rapport. And then, carefully, without altering his tone, he demonstrated knowledge he should not have possessed. Details from her past that had never existed online. Places she had lived under names that no longer connected to her. Fragments of timelines that had been deliberately broken. The implication settled between them like a held breath. She understood instantly who he was. Not the architect. The inheritor. The son of one of the system's primary beneficiaries, raised inside the machinery, polished for public roles, trained to negotiate rather than intimidate. He did not need violence. He wielded proximity to it. He let her know, subtly, that her recording had not gone unnoticed. That interest in it extended beyond the man she stood beside. That choices remained to be made. Not between right and wrong. Between alliances. Her life, he suggested without saying it, depended on where the fragment of truth landed. And so did the lives of those still tethered to her existence. The hook was baited with civility. She did not respond. She did not need to. When she returned to his side, the shift was immediate. The young man's confidence faltered by degrees too small to be obvious. Recognition passed through his expression, followed by recalculation. The board had changed. Later, standing above the city with glass and darkness between her and the lights, she felt the weight of the decision she had already made. She had stepped fully into the game now, not as a piece, but as a stake. The man beside her did not congratulate her. He did not reassure her. He simply remained, solid and unyielding, the kind of presence that did not gamble because it did not need to. She realized then the true cost of the deal she had entered. With him, she would not lose. But she would never again be innocent about winning. Las Vegas did not tighten its grip with violence. It tightened it with etiquette. After the auction, the city seemed to recognize her as a new kind of risk, the kind that could not simply be removed without costing someone face, money, or leverage. She felt it in the way doors opened faster, in the way security staff stepped aside a fraction earlier, in the way people who had ignored her before now offered smiles that measured her value before they offered politeness. She was no longer only a woman who had seen something. She was a woman, standing inside a perimeter that belonged to a man everyone in that room understood. His name carried weight in Vegas in a way that did not require a headline. He was not a celebrity, not a politician, not a gangster. He was an investor with clean optics and dirty reach, a quiet owner of roots and bottlenecks, stakes in clinics and logistics, shares in hospitality, ties to private security companies that pretended to be consultants. His power was the kind that could switch off a problem without anyone realizing a switch had been flipped. She learned his shape through effects rather than stories. A fine disappeared from a system. A complaint stopped propagating. A manager suddenly remembered her performance reviews were flawless. Problems did not vanish by chance, they dissolved by design. That design became her tool. In the days that followed, he did not give her a mission. He gave her access, invitations that included her without explanation. Car rides where she sat beside him as if it were normal. Waiting rooms where people spoke more carefully because she was present. He did not teach her how to hunt. He allowed her to walk close enough to predators that she began to understand their habits. She started with paperwork, because Vegas respected paperwork more than truth. She requested copies of internal club contracts under the pretense of verifying staff compliance. She asked for event invoices, supplier lists, guest transportation schedules. She watched which documents arrived instantly and which ones took too long, which names were redacted with unnecessary zeal, which signatures appeared everywhere like a watermark. Patterns emerged, not dramatic at first, but consistent enough to feel inevitable. Charity foundations that hosted fundraising dinners at casinos, then used the funds to purchase medical equipment through third-party vendors, then routed that equipment through logistics firms that belonged to the same private equity shell. Galleries that sold art at prices so inflated they became absurd, then transferred ownership to donors who never displayed the pieces, only insured them, only moved them, only used them as assets for something else. The intermediary sat in that repetition. He was not a headline man. He did not appear on stage or in board photos. He did not chair committees. He surfaced in the margins. As a consultant on a foundation's advisory board, as a curator credited in small print, as a strategic partner, thanked quietly at the end of gala brochures. His name appeared on invoices like dust that no one bothered to wipe away, because everyone had accepted dust as part of the room. She finally saw him in person, in a place designed to look harmless. A daylight gallery off the strip, all white walls and polite lighting, the kind of space that pretended art existed separate from violence. He moved through it with the unhurried grace of someone who knew the cameras were not there to watch him, but to watch everyone else. His suit was expensive without being loud. His hands were clean. His gaze was the kind that never lingered on faces too long, because faces were not the product. He recognized her instantly, and she recognized that recognition by the way his expression barely changed. He was trained to remain smooth even when surprised. That smoothness was its own confession. She did not approach him openly. She watched him interact with donors, with staff, with men who carried themselves like lawyers and men who carried themselves like security while insisting they were neither. She watched the subtle hierarchy of body language, who leaned toward him, who kept distance, who allowed themselves to be touched. She understood then that his business was not art. Art was camouflage, a socially acceptable way to move large amounts of money without questions. A painting was a container. A donation was a receipt. A charity event was an opportunity to align interests without leaving transcripts. And the night in the suite began to shift in her memory. The man bleeding on the carpet had not looked like a tourist. The laboratory case had not belonged in a luxury room. The foundation documents had not belonged on a casino table. Those were not random contradictions. Those were the seams where two systems stitched together: medicine and gambling, charity and laundering, public virtue and private trade. She stopped thinking of that night as an attempted murder. She began to see it as a negotiation that had failed. The bleeding man had not been eliminated because he witnessed something. He had been eliminated because he was part of something and tried to leave. She could almost feel the logic. Witnesses could be intimidated, bribed, bought, discredited. A defector threatened structure. A defector turned inside knowledge into catastrophe. Defection was the only act that required immediate correction. That understanding made her colder, sharper, more focused. It also made her easier to break. Because once she became competent, they stopped trying to scare her and started trying to control her. Pressure arrived as paperwork first. Her new job at the private club began to receive compliance visits, quiet audits by people with polite smiles and perfectly ironed shirts. They never accused her of anything directly. They asked questions in ways that established narratives. They requested records that forced her coworkers to resent her presence. They implied that her proximity to him created unnecessary risk for the club. Then pressure arrived as interference. Her apartment building's security system updated without warning, creating brief windows of camera blindness. Her mail arrived already opened and resealed. She began noticing a car that changed color depending on angle, always a few blocks behind, never close enough to prove. It was not the street-level stalking of criminals. It was the administrative stalking of institutions, the kind that left no fingerprints. She tried to hold steady. She tried to keep her fear private. And then they touched the one thread she could not harden into armor. Her sister, Rachel, lived out of state. A quiet life, a job that required trust, a medical history that meant she occasionally appeared in systems that stored names and files and vulnerabilities. Rachel was not part of Vegas, not part of the club, not part of any of this. She was the one person whose safety had existed outside the game. Until it didn't. It started as confusion, a missed call, a text that didn't land, then a notification from an automated system she didn't even remember being enrolled in, an appointment reminder for a clinic Rachel had never mentioned. When she called the number, it routed her through a menu that treated Rachel like a patient already admitted. The next call was worse. Records existed, then didn't. A nurse's name appeared, then the line went dead. The clinic's voicemail filled, then emptied. It was like watching someone erase a person through databases rather than through violence. No ransom demand arrived. No threat was spoken. That silence was the threat. They were showing her what modern disappearance looked like. Not a van and a bag over the head, but a clean gap in records, a missing chart, a reissued ID, a patient transferred under administrative error. A person swallowed by bureaucracy so completely that authorities would later argue she had never been there. Her stomach turned cold. Love, she realized, was the easiest way to steer a capable person. Fear for the self could be managed with pride. Fear for someone else stripped pride away. She took that fear to him and watched what happened to his face. He stayed controlled, but control did not mean indifference. His jaw tightened in a way that suggested he already understood the tactic. He did not ask for details with panic. He asked like a man assembling a response he had rehearsed long ago, because this was not the first time an enemy had tried to reach him through someone softer. She hated him for that preparedness. She hated herself for needing it. The fracture between them widened. She began to reinterpret the last weeks through a new lens. She looked at the way he had made her visible, the way the city's pressure had escalated exactly as her access increased. She looked at the timing of the auction, the way the intermediary had been present, the way the young heir had approached her with knowledge that suggested surveillance far deeper than casual interest. She started asking herself questions she didn't want answered. Had he positioned her as bait because she was the only piece that could draw the intermediary into the open? Had he used her recording as a hook, her fear as a leash, her presence as a signal flare? Had he protected her because she mattered, or because she was useful? The most dangerous part was that both could be true. Her attraction to him did not soften under suspicion. It sharpened. He was still the only presence that made the world feel less random. He was still the only person who could walk into a room full of predators and make them behave. His calm was addictive. It was a narcotic against chaos. She could feel herself wanting to surrender to that calm, even while her mind screamed that surrender was what people in this city called death. That contradiction turned her body into a battleground. She felt it when he stood too close behind her in elevators, not touching, just existing at her back like a wall. She felt it when his hand guided her through a crowd with a touch so brief it barely counted as contact, yet made everyone around them reevaluate their intentions. She felt it when he looked at her not with warmth, but with a cold certainty that implied he had already decided what she was to him. His jealousy, when it surfaced, did not look like romance. It looked like ownership defending itself. When the young heir appeared again, it wasn't at a gala. It was in daylight, in a place that pretended to be normal. A cafe where deals were discussed behind laptops, a strip mall where a private clinic hid behind a generic sign, a parking structure where cameras watched but never recorded the right angles. He approached with the same smooth politeness as before, as if he were simply continuing a conversation that had never ended. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He offered the idea of cooperation as if it were compassion. She understood him better now. He wasn't trying to intimidate her. He was trying to recruit her. He wanted her inside their structure not because he admired her, but because she was already inside someone else. If he could pull her away from her protector, he wouldn't just gain a peace. He would weaken a rival. He didn't need to say her sister's name out loud for her to feel it in the air. He made it clear an implication. Records could be restored, confusion corrected, a missing person returned to existence if she made the right choice. He suggested that her recording would be safer in the hands of people who understood how to handle it. He framed obedience as responsibility. She listened, her face controlled, her mind burning. Then she made her decision, without giving him the satisfaction of watching it form. She did not choose him. She did not choose her protector either. She chose herself, and that terrified her more than either man. That night she left. No dramatic escape, no scene, just absence executed with the same precision she had watched the city use against her. She waited for the right gap in surveillance, the moment when staff schedules overlapped and assumptions replaced observation. She used a vehicle she had access to only because people believed she would never act without permission. She packed light, taking only what mattered. A burner phone, a copy of the video fragment transferred to a device small enough to swallow if necessary, and a piece of paper with Rachel's last known clinic address. She crossed state lines under a borrowed name. She moved through highway darkness, where neon was replaced by truck lights and long stretches of emptiness that felt honest compared to Vegas. The farther she went, the more she understood the depth of her betrayal. Not betrayal of him. Betrayal of the system of safety he had wrapped around her. Every mile outside his perimeter made her more free and more killable. She sensed pursuit not as cars chasing her, but as systems pivoting. She imagined the quiet phone calls, the messages sent through encrypted channels, the polite requests that became orders. She imagined the city adjusting its grip, refocusing its attention, deciding that if she would not be contained, she would be removed. She also imagined him. Not angry in the way ordinary men were angry. Not hurt in the way ordinary men were hurt. Angry as a strategist whose controlled environment had been disrupted. Hurt as someone who did not tolerate being denied what he had already claimed. That thought did not comfort her. It made her legs feel weak on motel carpet. It made her hands tremble when she held the wheel. It made her realize something she hadn't admitted yet. Part of her wanted him to follow. Not because she wanted to be dragged back into a cage, but because she wanted proof that she mattered beyond utility. She hated that need. She hated how quickly it had grown. At the clinic, she found a building that looked harmless, a modest facade, a lobby with calming colors, Staff who smiled too easily. The kind of place designed to make people trust it. Rachel's name did not exist in their system. And yet she saw it, just once, in the hesitation behind a receptionist's eyes, in the quick glance toward a camera mounted too low on the wall, in the way a security door clicked shut with controlled timing. Her sister had been here, and someone had already begun the process of making it look like she hadn't. She felt the trap closing. The chapter ended not with a gun, not with a scream, but with the quiet horror of realizing how modern violence worked. It did not need blood. It needed compliance. It needed isolation. It needed the victim to believe she had no allies and no time. She stood in that lobby, alone, and understood the full cost of what she had chosen. Love had stopped being private. It had become a lever. If he reached her first, he would pull her back into his architecture, and she would survive in a cage that felt like safety. If the other side reached her first, Rachel would remain missing, and she would be forced to trade her own future for a version of her sister returned. And if no one reached her in time, she would disappear the way Rachel had begun to disappear, cleanly, administratively, without evidence. She had chosen risk over containment. Now the city was going to teach her what that choice really cost. Las Vegas turned off the lights the way it did everything else, quietly, professionally, and with plausible deniability. The city did not announce catastrophe. It adjusted to it. Neon still burned on the strip, music still leaked from doors, tourists still laughed as if the ground beneath them was not layered with contracts, debts, and erased names. But in the deeper structures, in the service corridors and private elevators, something shifted. The air carried a different density, the kind that arrived when systems prepared to self-correct. She returned to where it had begun. The closed wing of the casino hotel did not feel the same as it had when she had run through it bleeding fear into the carpet. She stepped into it now with a body that had learned how to move without sounding desperate. She carried no visible weapon, because weapons here were receipts, timestamps, and the correct person receiving the correct file at the correct moment. The hallway was unchanged in design, but not in meaning. Mirrors still widened the space. Carpet still muted footsteps. Cameras still watched with the indifferent patience of machines. Only now she saw the blind spots as intentional shapes rather than accidents. She recognized the way staff doors aligned to create funnel points. She understood where someone could wait without being filmed and where the ventilation hum would mask a breath. She was not alone, even when she walked alone. She had built redundancy into her plan the way a cautious person built exits into a burning house. The recording fragment was no longer the single point of failure. It lived in pieces across devices and accounts, encrypted and distributed. She had chain of custody notes written on paper because paper could not be wiped remotely. She had a transaction map that connected the charity foundation's accounts to the logistics company, to the private clinic network, to the art intermediaries' shell entities. She had patient identifiers that had been quietly transferred across states and then disappeared. She had a list of names that never appeared together in public, but repeated in back-end signatures like a hidden hymn. Most importantly, she had the shape of the man in gloves. Not his face, but his function. Not his name alone, but his place in the machinery. He was not an independent predator. He was an operator, a specialist inserted wherever a clean correction was needed. He touched pulses not because he cared whether people lived, but because he needed to know whether they could still talk. She had learned enough to understand that exposing him alone would not dismantle the structure. It would only replace him. So she aimed higher. The trap was built around the same principle her enemies had used against her: bureaucracy as violence, procedure as restraint. The offer came before the threat, framed as necessity. A meeting, an arrangement, a path toward resolution. People spoke in professional tones, careful to avoid language that could later be interpreted as coercion. They offered her a way to save her sister and preserve her own life if she agreed to be reasonable. Reasonable meant compliant. The young heir appeared as if he belonged to the building, dressed in a way that looked neutral but cost more than most people earned in a year. His presence carried the polished authority of inherited control. He did not bring men with guns. He brought advisors with tablets. He brought a contract that resembled a romance on paper and a leash in reality. A public union. A strategic partnership. An engagement that would place her inside their structure so deeply that her evidence could be reclassified as property, her voice reinterpreted as hysteria, her resistance reframed as instability. It was presented as safety. It was a legal noose. The contract promised that Rachel would be returned to existence. It promised medical care, protection, restoration. It promised that the system would stop pressing down on her life because her life would no longer be hers to press. In exchange, she would sign away the one thing they truly feared: control of her truth. She agreed to play the role because minutes mattered more than pride. Her face remained calm while her mind counted seconds like a timer. She let the scene shape itself around her, let the young heir believe he had succeeded. She watched which devices recorded which angles. She noted the names on the badges, the companies they claimed to represent, the subtle panic hidden behind their competence. She read the contract's language with a cold clarity that came from weeks of learning how institutions killed softly. She signed. Not as surrender, but as a trigger. A pen moved across paper, and at the same time, elsewhere, copies moved through channels she had already prepared. A message left her burner phone and reached a receiver that did not belong to Vegas. A file, broken into harmless segments, reassembled itself in a system designed to preserve evidence rather than bury it. Her transaction map, her patient list, her proof of interference, and the corrupted video fragment were no longer stored where Vegas could reach with a single call. They were no longer manageable. That was when the city began to truly sharpen. The pressure intensified immediately, not with violence but with speed. Staff members appeared where they did not belong, concerned about her well-being. Security shifted positions with unnatural coordination. The young heir's expression stayed smooth, but his eyes recalculated. Someone somewhere had realized that her compliance was too clean to be real. She pushed forward anyway. The closed wing held more than luxury rooms. It held the arteries of the building, access to service elevators, control panels, maintenance corridors that bypassed public spaces. Her sister would not be kept in a suite. Rachel would be kept in the kind of place designed for transfer, not comfort. She followed the routes that smelled faintly of antiseptic rather than perfume, the corridors where the carpet ended and sealed flooring began. She found the evidence of a clinical presence inside a building, built to sell indulgence. A locked door with a keypad that did not match hotel standards. A cart marked as housekeeping that carried supplies too sterile for linens. The faint, wrong scent of disinfectant that belonged to clinics and private rooms, not casinos. She did not panic. She moved like someone who had already accepted that fear was not useful. When the door finally opened, it was not because she defeated the lock. It was because someone wanted her inside. Rachel was there, not in a dramatic state, not bound or bruised, but dulled. Sedated enough to be compliant, present enough to be shown as proof that the system could give and take life's details at will. Her sister's eyes were open, unfocused, her skin too pale under fluorescent light. The horror of it was not that she had been beaten. It was that she had been reduced to a file in a cabinet. The moment she reached Rachel, the building's atmosphere changed again. The lights shifted. Not all of them at once. Not an outage that would attract attention. A subtle dimming in specific corridors, enough to distort cameras, enough to create confusion. The kind of technical darkness that allowed people to move without being documented. Vegas was not turning off the strip. It was turning off the truth. She heard movement before she saw it. Steps in the corridor, controlled and unhurried, professionals, operators, people who did not shout because shouting was for amateurs. The gloved man was not the only one now. The system had sent its hands. She lifted Rachel, feeling the weight of her sister's body as the most tangible proof of what had been done. The exit route she had planned narrowed into impossibility. Doors that had been open earlier were now locked. The service elevator refused to respond. The corridor behind her held shadows that moved with coordinated intention. Then he arrived. Not with sirens. Not with an entourage designed to impress. He arrived like a break in a pattern, sudden and absolute. The sound of his presence was not loud, but the space seemed to acknowledge him. The operators hesitated, not from fear of his violence, but from fear of his authority. He moved with the cold decisiveness of someone who had already chosen destruction over negotiation. He had broken his own rules to reach her. His influence had always worked through quiet corrections, through prevention rather than confrontation. Tonight he was doing the opposite. He was forcing a collision. He was tearing a seam open wide enough for the world outside Vegas to see what the city kept hidden. She understood the cost immediately. By stepping into this wing and acting openly, he was sacrificing the very advantage that made him untouchable. He was turning his private power into a public statement. He was declaring that deals were over and consequences had begun. The gloved man moved first, because operators knew when systems were collapsing and survival required speed. The encounter was not cinematic. It was efficient and brutal in a way that felt real. A shove into a wall. A hand reaching for a weapon that never fully appeared. A struggle that happened mostly in silence, because noise would attract the wrong kind of attention. She did not watch for drama. She watched for an exit. He created it. A door opened that should not have opened. A hallway cleared that should have been blocked. The system, briefly, obeyed him more than it obeyed its architects. She carried Rachel out, her arms shaking from exertion and anger. Her sister's breath was shallow but steady, the only reassurance she could allow herself. She moved through corridors that had once been her prison, now her battlefield. Behind them, the city began to eat itself. Arrests did not unfold with grand speeches. They happened fast and strangely, like a chain of dominoes triggered from outside. A foundation's accounts froze. A clinic received an emergency compliance raid it could not anticipate. A logistics firm's licenses were suspended. A gallery's private vaults were sealed. People who had spent decades building reputations discovered that reputations were useless against evidence already delivered to the wrong hands. Stock prices dipped quietly, then sharply. Partnerships dissolved. Contracts that had been protected by fear became liabilities overnight. Men in suits who had smiled at charity auctions disappeared from guest lists and office hallways. Vegas did not mourn them. Vegas pretended nothing happened. Neon still burned. Dealers still shuffled cards. The strip still sold fantasies to strangers. The city maintained its performance with professional discipline because performance was how it survived. But the air changed. In the aftermath, she stood outside the hotel at a distance where the lights looked beautiful again, as if beauty could erase what they had done in the dark. Rachel was alive, still fragile, still half erased in ways paperwork could not restore instantly. Her own body hummed with the aftershock of adrenaline, her mind replaying every corridor, every lock, every moment she had pretended to surrender in order to win seconds. He stood beside her, close enough to be a presence, not close enough to be comfort. He did not apologize. He did not offer softness to smooth over the scars. He looked like a man who had paid a price and considered the payment necessary. A man who understood that this was not a fairy tale resolution. It was a recalibration of power, and power always demanded more later. She felt the dark romance of it not as romance, but as tension that refused to die. Her freedom smelled like fear and disinfectant. His protection smelled like control and smoke and money. Their connection did not promise healing. It promised continuation, a shared understanding that love here was not a cure. It was a weapon kept close, polished, and dangerous. She had survived. But survival in Vegas was never the end. It was the beginning of a new kind of visibility. She knew too much now. And if she stayed with him, it would not be because he was good. It would be because he was the only one who could stand beside her darkness. Without demanding, she pretended to be light. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.